Hello and welcome to a special edition of Fussball Geeks. So we're flipping the tables this time around. So our usual host Phil is now a nervous guest, and today we're going to talk about Phil's new book, Inside the Hermit Kingdom, which is the history of Albanian football. So I suppose welcome, Phil.
Hello, how are you, mate? Thanks for doing this. Yeah, as we were saying before I went online, it's very different being a guest as it is to being a host. You have to actually do a bit of a preparation for it. So, but yeah, it's I'm looking forward to it, mate. Looking forward to it.
Well, clearly, from reading the book, huge amount of interest and passion gone into the book. So I suppose we'll start there. I mean, I think most people I know, if they're British based, they have an interest in Italian football, in German football, and Brazilian football. It's not probably one of your top 10 destinations. So what was it that really dragged you in and made you fascinated in this story?
Yeah, well, as I've said before, like it's a book that was kind of like 1 year in the writing and 35 years in its kind of in its gestation, really. Because, but I always kind of gravitate towards places that are harder to reach. And although you can now visit Albania, you can't visit Albania during the Stalinist era. I said before on other podcasts, it's akin to like Victorian Britain or Caesar's Rome. It's the same patch of land, but it's completely unrecognizable from what it was back then. But what really hooked me was the international between Albania and England in 1989 that took place at the Stadio Mike Mustafa in Tirana. First time that England had ever played Albania, and the BBC ran a film aside from the actual coverage itself, and it depicted, the typical kind of Albanian things that you would, or communist things that you would expect to see. And there were like cart horses running through kind of desolate streets, and there were bunkers and food queues. But rather than put me off, I was darkly fascinated by all this kind of stuff. I don't know what that says about me, but I was really interested. So I stayed abreast of Albanian football from there on, through the dual vehicles of World Soccer and European Football Yearbook. The only two things really where you could read up on Albania, really. And then in 1992, this was another happy accident. I talk about the book being a happy accident in the introduction, but as a happy accident, me and my friends visited Corfu on a holiday in 1992 and realised that they did day trips to Albania. Well, having this kind of this interest already, we decided to jump on board and go over to Albania, and it dropped us off in a southern Albanian city called Saranda. And in the book, I say it was a beautiful place, but it was like he was in need of care. It had just started to there were very limited signs of Western consumerism coming in. There was a small market economy going on. There were a few cafeterias on the seafront, pretty ramshackle and pretty basic. But the people were really, it was poor, really poor. The kind of poverty that you would never expect to see in Europe. But they were intensely happy and sort of proud to be Albanian in this kind of exciting new future that had opened up for them. So yes, we went on this trip to Albania in '92, and then a year later we went back to Corfu with a plan to go back and spend a little bit more time there, and that resulted in a three-pronged ground hop. And we went to a club called Butrint, who were stationed in Saranda, and went to Dalvina, and then we went to Gjirokastër, which is an incredible ground. I said before, it's like dug into the kind of basin of this southern city, and overlooked by hills, and it's surrounded by these old Soviet prefabricated flats. It's a really interesting ground to visit. So that's what hooked me to Albania. It was the culmination of things, but it all started in 1989 with England's international in Tirana.
And did you have an opportunity to go to games, or was that during the closed season then for?
No, it was just the season had just opened. We went to
Right.
one in Girocaster. We didn't get to there wasn't one on in Saranda and Butrint. We just kind of like had a look at the grounds. But there was a game in Girocaster, and that was that was interesting. It was exciting. There was about 500 fans there, but they were very, very, they were very intense. It was quite, it wasn't. It wasn't they weren't pretending. They were there to kind of like support their team with all the passion that you would probably get like at Old Trafford or at Anfield. They were serious supporters.
And was there anything else, I suppose, that struck you as so that's similar crowd to a second or third step non-league English ground? So were there any sort of striking differences in terms of that experience of going to a league match in Albania for you?
Well, it was just very kind of very rudimentary. There was no kind of food available, no programs, nothing aside from the football, which sort of like lays testament to the kind of information I've been given by a few collaborators who were there during the Albanian time. It hadn't kind of grown. Football hadn't grown up in Albania to the extent that it did in England. So there was no kind of commerciality attached to it aside from buying a ticket to go into the ground, really. So I think that's changed a little bit now, obviously, but back then they were simpler times.
And I suppose this really colours the experience, but again, people's knowledge of Albanian history might not be, probably complete. So do you want to maybe mention a couple of the kind of major events, explain periods kind of under communism and the end of that era that I suppose help frame a lot of the things that you're going to talk about today? So yeah, what maybe two or three key events that where the situation in Albania changed?
Well, of course, I mean, communism came to Albania in around 1944. A guy called Enver Hoxha was very, very instrumental in the kind of formation of the Albanian Party of Labour. Prior to that, they were a protectorate of Italy, and when Italy fell out of the war in around 42, they swapped the Italian fascist invaders for German fascist invaders, who were eventually, due to the alliance with the British troops, they managed to force Germany out of Albania. But there were two political kind of entities in place. So there was the communists, and then there was the Bali Kombatar, who were the National Front in Albania, not to be related to other National Front movements. They were nationalists, but they weren't especially right wing. But what you have to understand is that Albania had never had a independence as such. In 1912, there was the Young Turk Revolution in Albania, which freed them from the Ottoman Empire for a couple of years. But then Italians took over. They signed a treaty with Italy, and they become a protectorate of Italy then, and that remained until as I say, 1943, 42, 43. So they'd never tasted a meaningful independence before, which I feel left them more susceptible to the advent of communism, because you got this guy Hoxha coming in and he's saying, there's going to be independence, there's going to be revolution. But what he failed to mention was that that didn't really run in tandem with freedom. So the communists came into power, and for the first decade and a half, it was going okay. They'd kind of they'd drained the malarial marshlands. There was a kind of market economy taking place. There was industry was booming, but as I explore in the book, that was due to chiefly the funding of other people. They weren't a self-sufficient country. So the socialist dream, although they were trying to implement it, it's not doable without self-reliance, and Albania certainly weren't that.
And then I suppose coming to the end then of that communist era then, so when did that happen?
Well, communism rolled on for a few years longer than it did in the rest of Europe. When the wall was falling in Berlin in November 1989, Albanians were oblivious of this happening, because Albania wasn't attached to any other communist state. It left the Warsaw Pact in the late 60s after the Czech Revolution, and they were completely detached from the rest of the communist East Bloc. They had a relationship with Maoist China up until 1978, but until after that, they were completely on their own. So they didn't know what was really going on in the rest of Europe. Obviously, there was a drip of information coming through the Yugoslav and Italian kind of TV channels, but it rolled on unabated to 1991-92 communism, eventually completely leaving the country in 1992. When there was the dual party system came into place, and a democratically elected party came into power. So yeah, that communism went on for a lot longer in Albania.
And so moving kind of into the away from the football pitch and onto the football pitch, you've talked about a lot of teams, obviously, and a lot of players. And let's start with the first one. So who are the players who really stood out for you, the icons of Albanian football, a few that yeah?
Well, we'll start pre-war, because when Albanians were de facto Italian footballers, a lot of Albanians pre-World War II were snapped up by Italian clubs. And there were two players in particular who were hugely successful in what was then the Italian Championship, which became Serie A. They played for a team called Tirona, who were the first real giants of Italian football, of Albanian football. Sorry, they came into existence in 1920. An Albanian football league was set up in 1930. And they were overseen by a guy called Salman Stamasi, who had played for AS Roma between 1928 and 1930. He was an incredible athlete and a rich benefactor, really. What you could like a mogul in the old school kind of sense.
Yeah.
So he played for Roma, and he sort of did a bit of coaching in Italy as well. And when he came back, he transposed all that kind of experience and tactical nous onto an Albanian team that had just taken its place in the Campionati Kombëtar, which is the national championship of Albania, and they were incredible. They won 6 of the 7 initial championships in Albania, and towards the tail end of the 30s, a lot of Italian clubs came over and they watched Albanian players. And 2 players that particularly took their fancy was a player called Naim Kraizu, who was a left winger, very fast, very nimble, and also there was a kind of rumbustious centre forward called Riza Lushta, and they took them to Italy. The scouts took him to Italy. However, Salman Stamasi said that he wanted these players to be purchased for a fair price. He wouldn't let them go freely just because they were kind of de facto Italians. So he got a fee for them, but he then gave the fee, split it in half, and gave it to the boys to take to Italy to settle in Italy. So Lushta, he went and joined Bari down in the deep south, and Krieza played for Roma, and they took a couple of seasons to bed into the Italian game. Lushta did enough at Bari to signal interest from Juventus, and he joined Juventus in time for the 40-41 season. But where the story really started for them was the 41-42 season. You know, Italy were fresh from being world champions. The Italian league was widely considered apart from in England, of course, where there was a very kind of polarized view about English football. But throughout Europe, it was regarded as the best league in Europe. And these two boys from Albania have headed over there. And Creso, he won the Italian championship with Roma that year, 1941-42. The first time that a team from the south had ever won the Italian Scudetto. Before then, it was all northern teams. I mean, this was Benito Mussolini's vision of the time, was to have Rome as the footballing centre of Italy. So Roma, in winning the championship with Creso as part of that team, they'd done the regime a favour. Really, they'd brought to life the Mussolini vision. And in the same season, Rizzalusta, in a disappointing league season for Juventus, they went on to win the Coppa Italia, beating Milan in the final quite convincingly, with Lusta scoring a hat-trick. And his goals throughout their run to the final have been the kind of fuel that took Juventus to that final. So in the land of world champions, the two Albanian boys have become champions. So they were the first two really big players of Albanian descent who kind of made an impression, but not only in Albania, on the wider European continent. But then we move onwards a little bit, and then there was a guy called Lauro Baricci who also played football in Italy. He played for Lazio in around the same period that Lusta and Creso were playing for Juventus and Roma. But at the end of the 1943 season, he was a bit disenchanted. He was a player in the same stylings of Silvio Piola, who also played for Lazio, who'd also just become the capo cannoniere in Italy. So the chances of him getting first team football were very limited. So he made his way in 1943 back to Albania, which was a shame, because about a month after he arrived back on Albanian shores, Piola was sold up north to Torino. So there could have been that kind of window of opportunity for Baricci to make his name in Italy. He was certainly respected by the Italian fans. They liked him. They thought he was a great player, but he was already back on Albanian and soil, and he rejoined Vlasnia, who won the first two post-war championships, but then was assigned to a new project that we'll probably talk about later, a super club that had emerged in 1946, and that was Partizani Tirana, but I'm sure we'll touch on that a little bit later. But in 1946, the Albanian national side, captained by Lauro Baricci, in their first three competitive internationals, they'd played a friendly against Montenegro previously, about a week prior to this tournament that they entered, which was the Balkan Cup tournament. In their first three after their first three competitive internationals in the Balkan Cup that was hosted in Tirana, they won their first international title. So, and Baricci was the captain of that side. He was the kind of leading light. He was the creative focal point of that side. So he was a very big player in the 40s and 50s in Albania. And I mentioned Partizani, who were the first super club. There was a guy called Refik Resma who played for them in the 50s, and we'll step forward to the 1951 season, which was an incredible record-breaking season in Albanian football, because Resma, in 23 league games, he was injured for a couple. In 23 league games, he scored 59 league goals, right, which was an average of 2.7 goals a game, so almost a hat-trick every game, which remains the highest goal ratio in European football for a season. He scored the most hat-tricks in Albanian history in one season, scored 10 hat-tricks. So it was incredible. And that season, Partizani, to show you the disparity between them and other teams in the division, they scored 136 goals, conceded only 10, but still only finished runners-up in the league, which is absurd. They finished runners-up, and they finished runners-up in the cup as well. So despite this plethora of goals and these incredible records that were broken by Refik Resner, they ended up with nothing at the end of the season. So it was quite an irony there. And then moving on, we had in the book I touch on the story of Panayot Pano and Skender Halili, who are two of the finest players of their era, which oddly enough, in reaching out to the Albanian community, I've now got shirts from Partizani and from KF Tirana, who I've referred to as Tirana before, that were signed by both Panayot Pano and Skender Halili's family.
Wow.
But yeah, it's amazing. So this is what happens when you write a book on Albanian football. Albanians are incredibly generous and open and friendly people, and they love you for it. I can only hope that they love the book, because I wouldn't want to see an angry Albanian. Yeah. If that's the amount of passion they give to their friends, what do they do to their enemies? But these two guys were, I won't give too much away about this chapter, but they were two great players of the 60s era. Panayot Pano moving into the 70s as well, but both of their careers took on very divergent directions. Becoming a hero and this huge kind of player in Albania, whereas Skender Halili's career was cut short, and it was due to the regime that it was cut short. But that's a story for people to read about when they pick up the book, hopefully.
And like you say, there are so many stories that you've illustrated over the 60s, 70s, into the 80s, 90s, etc. But yeah, we could, I'm sure we could spend a whole day covering all of those. So kind of to move on to more the teams, you talked about Partizani. Could you give maybe a flavour of some of the leading teams in Albania and perhaps their character, or what they represented, or the characteristics that made them?
Well, we'll start off with Partizani and Dynamo, because they were the. I mean, we've talked about Tirana, who were the team of the 30s, but the team of the kind from the mid 40s to the mid 60s, they were the teams of the regime who were Partizani. They were formed in 1946 under the name initially of Austria, which means army in Albanian. And they played in that customary kind of deep red shirt that they still wear to this day. So that's kind of gone beyond communism. They still play in the red colours, and they became the team of the army. And for the first 4 years of their existence, they won everything. No other club won a championship or a cup in that time. But they sourced players in a very kind of anti-socialist way, and that was, if they liked a player, they'd ask a guy called Petric Doom, I'm on a surname, but he was the kind of army general. They'd speak to their patron Petric Doom and say, "Can you call this player up for national service?" And by doing so, that made him the player that they'd chosen directly kind of selectable for Partizani, and they did this with a number of players, to such an extent that in their opening national championship game of 1947, they played Tirana, who were the big team in the 30s, and 8 of Partizani's starters in that game were players that had played for Tirana the previous season. Right. So it was a very kind of it was weighed in the favour of the super clubs. Well, that was the initial super club Partizani, who were formed in 1946, but then in 1950, the Ministry of the Interior and the secret police, to the Soviet template of the time, created their own club, who, like so many other kind of secret police clubs of the Eastern Bloc, were called Dynamo, and that was Dynamo Tirana. And their inception saw a 5-year kind of half decade of pure domination from them, where they won virtually everything. But again, they worked on the same kind of transfer system as Partizani, and ironically, they kind of hijacked a lot of Partizani players using the same methods that Partizani had used post World War II. So again, it was all weighed in the favour of the super clubs, and for the first 18 years of their existence, nobody else won the league. It was all Partizani and Dynamo, until there was a resurgence of Tirana in the mid 1960s, who were by now called 17 Nendori. I have to say that in the 50s there was a huge name change of teams to take on more Albanian communist names, and 17 Nendori was the 17th of November, when the communists had gained kind of passage into Tirana and freed it from the clutches of the Nazis. So they became a team, and they were persecuted badly by the Albanian regime. They were seen as the bourgeois team. Salman Stamasi had links in Italy, and when they kind of gained independence, Stamasi was demonized, chiefly because of his links with Italy, but also in 1951 there was a first 1948 there was a first renaming of the teams. So SK Tirana, as they were at the time, went to an Albanian FA meeting and were told that they would take on the name of Puna Tirana, which meant work. And Stamasi was irate, and you know, he told the Albanian kind of FA exactly how he felt about it, and they hated him for it. And within 2 years, he was liquidized. And he was tilling the fields of you know, agricultural Albania, and he never returned to football until his death in 1976. But Tirana had rebuilt under a coach called Mislim Allah, who was very astute, very intelligent. He was the first player to transpose the libero on Albanian football, and that was Skender Halili, the player who was very much like Beckenbauer in his stylings. But as Beckenbauer was kind of asserting himself at the 1966 World Cup, Skender Halili's career had already ended in Albania, which I've alluded to before. But then we move on. They won 2 consecutive championships in 1964, 65, 66. And then in the book, there's a chapter which talks about the Championship of Coals, which is 1966, 67, which I won't go into too much detail about because it's an incredible story, all true. And it affected the Albanian football for a long time afterwards. Their kind of involvement in European football waned after that season because of what happened and how the regime dealt with what happened. So this was like football and politics interlocking so tightly that it affected the whole of society in a way. So really fascinating stories. And then we move into the 70s, where Dynamo Tirana again became ascendant. We talk about great players. Well, they had a troika of players. The main goal scorer was a guy called Ilya Panaska, who had played for Tirana, but they didn't rate him, and they let him go to Dynamo, which was ironic because after Dynamo robbing so many of Tirana's players, they gave possibly the best one away to Dynamo, and he became a kind of record goal scorer in the Albanian league. But they also had 2 creative guys around it. There's Shakira Baljikia and Vasilik Zeri, and if you speak to Albanians of that era, they always kind of talk about those 3 as being an incredible troika of footballers who took Dynamo into their second golden age.
I think the goal scorer he scored twice on his debut at 16 or something.
He did, yeah. He scored twice on his debut against Lushnia, who feature quite a lot in the book because of what happened with Mario Kempes in the 1990s, of course. But that's something for people to read about. Should they purchase the book, which I hope they do. But yeah, 16-year-old in his first game, and he scored 2 on his debut. So it was written from the very start for him that he was going to become an Albanian legend, and ironically, in a country where there was where any social discord was quickly stepped upon. Graffiti appeared on the Kemal Stafa Stadium, daubed in blue paint, and it read "Panaska Goal," which obviously means alluded to his ability to stick the ball in the back of the net. The fact that it stayed there for almost a decade seems to show what Albanians and of all kind of social levels thought of Ilir Panaska.
And sorry, I'm just going to plug my laptop in, technical issues. But we've talked a lot about obviously the domestic scene here, and that was like really heavily shaped by, as you say, politics in every aspect, like individual players, the fortunes of teams, and so on. But you mentioned that there was obviously they were still featuring against the outside world at the international level, and also in European club competitions. As you've said from your own experiences, it's very different to early 90s England. And it was the same case, wasn't it, for foreign players coming to Albania, either at club or country level? So maybe, I don't know, you want to go through some of the experiences that that some players had, and particularly some romantic experiences, perhaps.
So, how do you mean by that, Alex? Sorry, because I'm just.
Oh, so there's a story about Gerd Muller.
Oh yeah. Sorry, yeah. So Gerd Muller, yeah, in 1967, the West German national team were played in Tirana against Albania. Now this was a kind of it was a European Championship qualifier, with West Germany needing a win to get to the European Championships in Italy. They were 1 point behind Yugoslavia. A win would have taken them to the finals. On arrival, they had all the kind of big players from the 1966 World Cup winning team. Beckenbauer's there, Overrath, amongst a plethora of others. But they brought with them an exciting new prospect, a goal-scoring kind of machine called Gerd Muller. However, when they arrived in Tirana, in the dark kind of winter months of 1967, they took their kind of place at the Hotel Date in Tirana, and it's rumoured that Gerd Muller fell in love with one of the kind of with one of the kitchen staff there, a girl called Hojna. Now, whether this is true or not is open for wide debate. But what I would say is that apropos to no injury, Gerd Muller didn't play in that game. Neither did Franz Beckenbauer. He was injured, but Gerd Muller was totally uninjured, and he didn't play in that game. A couple of seasons later, they were drawn against Albania again, and this time Gerd Muller came back with the German club. Whether these kind of passions were reignited is unknown, but he did score the winner in Tirana in a World Cup qualifier. But then, in a kind of odd twist to the tale, in the mid 1980s, a Finnish team were they were drawn against one of the Tirana teams in the UEFA Cup, and this Finnish club received a letter from Gerd Muller. It's ridiculous, saying, "Can I join your club on a one-match contract to go and play in Albania with your club? I don't want any payment for it. Just let me come with you." So it does seem that there was some credence to this incredible story, that one of the greatest goal scorers of all time having a kind of girlfriend in Albania.
I suppose that positive experience is really kind of outweighed by the majority of experiences in terms of the authorities weren't exactly welcoming, were they, to travelling sides. I think really it seems, in contrast to what you said at the individual level with the hospitality of Albanian people, the authorities in a way seem to make it as difficult as possible in many ways for travelling sides in terms of visas and things like that.
Yeah, there were plenty of stories of that. I mean, I'll just draw on the one, which is the Ajax experience of the late 70s. They received a letter from the Albanian kind of government saying, your players need to kind of like cut their hair and shave their beards before they come to Albania, or they won't be allowed. Now, we're talking about the days of kind of Barry Hulshoff, you know, and Johan Cruyff with a kind of quite long hair, and there was Johnny Rep. So they all had to have the hair trimmed when they before they went to Albania, on fear of not being allowed into the country. But when they arrived there, the Albanian regime were very kind of unkind about them when they arrived. When they arrived with all their own food. This had happened before, and the Albanian authorities, and particularly the chef at the hotel they were staying in, wasn't particularly pleased with the fact that they bought their own food. Sausages in particular, they didn't like sausages over there. And Ajax, as a kind of peace offering, so okay, you can have the food, and they gave the food to everybody apart from the chef who complained about it. So meted out a sort of justice there. But when the team and the Wags appeared at the Kemal Stafford to kind of have a pre-match amble around the stadium and warm up on the day before the game, the Albanian press were particularly unkind about them, and I think the quote was, "Who are these people? Are they cartoons?" You know, dressed up in their bright Western colours, which were strictly outlawed in Albania, especially after 1967, which was the rewriting of the constitution, which I go into some depth in the book. So there was a lot of hostility, a lot of unkindness, and every sort of team that visited Albania during that time recount similar experiences. In fact, like Kilmarnock, they went there in 1966, and then Linfield went there in 1983, and the two stories are literally the same story. You know, so nothing had changed in those elapsing 17 years between 66 and 83. The level of you know of poor kind of relations with other countries was still there. It never froze. They were a country pretty much frozen in time.
And moving from kind of the club game to the international game, so you know, there've been some good, memorable results against the likes of Celtic and so on for Albanian club sides, but they haven't traditionally gotten very far in the European competitions. But there's been a couple of kind of near scrapes in terms of qualifying for major tournaments, and maybe talk about Albania's record at qualifying for the major tournaments.
Well, the one big near miss was the Mexico World Cup 1986. The guy who instigated this was a guy called Shaqiri Relly, who was by all accounts, there's very little footage of him to see what kind of player he was, but by all accounts from people who I spoke to, he was an incredible footballer, and he played for the Dynamo team in the 1950s, the team that won title after title, cup after cup, and he was the kind of engine room of that team. So he was a prodigious footballing talent. And then in 1972, he was elevated into the role of overseeing all of the non-senior Albanian teams. And immediately it brought about a qualitative improvement in the Albanian teams at that level. Bear in mind, they'd rarely been able to leave the country prior to this, so they hadn't been able to test themselves. Well, Relly ensured that did happen, and he took them outside the country. And in the late 70s, they won 2 Balkan Cup tournaments. They beat a Yugoslavian team in 1978 on the way to the final, that went on to win that very same year's European under-21s tournament. So you can see what kind of team that they were. They were pretty decent. And then they won the final of the Balkan Cup tournament, beating Romania in Tirana 7-1 in one of the great undocumented performances of Albanian football history. And they went back the next year to Greece, and they won the title again, beating Bulgaria in the final. So they were improving. And Shaqiri Relly was then given the role as national coach in 1982, after Loro Barici's failed campaign as Albanian manager to qualify for the 82 World Cup. And his first tournament was to try and qualify them for the Euros 1984. And although they finished bottom of the group and accrued 2 points, all of the defeats were 1-0 defeats, 1-0, 2-1. So the kind of, whereas under Barici they've been losing 8-0 in West Germany, 5-0 in Austria. They lost to West Germany, but yeah, on both occasions they lost 2-1. So there was a tightening in the kind of margins, and they were giving good teams difficult games. So that leads us on to the qualifying campaign for Mexico 1986, and a crux game just before Christmas. They prior to this game they were third in their group, but they invited Belgium over to Tirana, and they beat them. But they didn't only beat them; they outplayed Belgium. And bear in mind, this is a Belgium that had been in the European Championship final. Same remnants of that team were still in this team. They've been at the World Cup.
And people like that.
Yeah. They've been at the World Cup in 82, Euros in 84, and they would go on to qualify for Mexico and finish 4th in that tournament. So yes, Schifo, Keulemans, Gerets, amongst others, in this very talented Belgian team, and they turned them over. So by Christmas, Albania were in one of the qualification places to go to Mexico, and it sort of had an effect on the nation. I talk about it in the book, and my friend Irving, who collaborated heavily on the book, he told me he was at this game. It's ridiculous. He was at this game, and he said you could feel that something was changing within Albania, although you didn't really know what. I mean, as they were walking away from the Kemal staff, people were talking about, we could be in Mexico, not really knowing where Mexico was or what happened in Mexico, but people were looking beyond the Albanian borders at a world outside for the first time, since Stalinism had taken hold of the country. So it was a real it was a rebirth game for the Albanian nation. That kind of sense that bigger things were going to happen, greater dreams were achievable, as I say in the book. So it was very crux in Albanian history. It was a biggie for the Albanians.
And then thinking of the kind of modern era, that post-communist era, how has kind of the club game and evolved when you've not got this restrictive system in place?
Well, initially, after communism fell towards the tail end of 1991, early part of 92, the first season back after communism, a team called Punatori Potosi were promoted to the to what then became the Categoria Superior, the first tier of Albanian football. So Punatori had been promoted, and then they were kind of offered sponsorship by the Albanian, the new Albanian kind of petrol magnate called Al Petrol. And they shed the Punatori, which was a very much a communist kind of thing, again involving the kind of moniker of work in it, and they became Alb Petrol Potosi. So they survived in the league in their first season, but more pointedly, they reached the Albanian Cup final, where they faced Partizani, who'd already won the league, and they lost narrowly, 1-0 in the final. But because Partizani had taken the newly forming Champions League, European Cup place, whatever you want to call it, that left Al Petrol with a berth in the European Cup Winners' Cup. So in the first season of sponsorship, they found their way into Europe by some miracle of chance. So what that did was open up a whole kind of window for buyers who wanted to invest money into clubs with a view of creating a name for themselves in the game. And it happened on a few occasions throughout the 90s, and on virtually every occasion there were bad outcomes. So westernization in a country that could barely stand on its own 2 feet, kind of metaphorically, didn't really work. And post-communism, there were other scandals. There was match fixing allegations there was a company called Sports Radar who looked at a number of results around Albania, and it became given the unwanted label of the country with the most fixed or suspectedly fixed games in Europe. So the transition wasn't great, although what I would say now things are improved. Evidently, they're at the Euros this coming summer. Initially, what happened when Albania split was that everybody left the country. The people, anybody who could leave the country left the country. In 2016 at the Euros, when Albania played Switzerland, 6 of the Swiss players in that starting lineup were either Albanian born or of Albanian descent.
Yeah.
So you can see what the fall of communism did. Their diaspora spread across Europe, and started kind of playing football in other countries, and then adopting the nationalities of those countries, which evidently is not good for the domestic or the international scene in Albania. But recently, Albanians that were born abroad, the chief example I can think of at the moment is Armando Broja, who's a London-born Cockney Albanian who plays for the Albanian national team. So it now seems that a lot of Albanians are kind of drawing on that innate Albanian sense of Albanianism, and playing for the national team, in preference to the country that they're actually born in. So this augurs well for the future. I think it's definitely a positive for the Albanian national side, although I don't see this kind of transposing onto the domestic game, which I think will always sort of be at the level it's at the moment. But from a national point of view, I think Albanian football could be set for a new golden era.
So you mentioned there that finally, after all this fanatical support and love for the team, and that you say the near miss in '86, you finally get to a big tournament in 2016. So, from colleagues and people you've spoken to, what was that sort of experience like, and how was that received back at home?
Well, evidently with utter delight. They qualified quite comfortably as well. There was that incident in Serbia. I don't know, that was quite well documented, where the drone came onto the pitch, but they were duly awarded a 3-0 win, which made their progression a lot easier. But it's football is still religion in Albania. I speak about it in the book. In 1967, when religion was banned in Albania, it did become kind of religion, but it's sort of remained like that. I think what communism has done to Albania, it kind of diminished religion even to the present day. It's a Muslim kind of country, but it's very passive in its acceptance of the Islamic faith. People practice it, but they don't practice it in the way that it would be practiced in other countries, because there was that lull in belief. But one of the constants was that football became that filler for religion. And it's still an incredibly passionate country when it comes to football. Evidently, it's in close proximity with Italy, where you get the real ultras and the tifosi, and there is that element in Albania now as well. The clubs have got huge ultra support. There's so yeah, it was, in answer to the initial question, their arrival on the kind of the proper competitive international scene in Europe was greeted with huge delight in Albania.
So I think you've really given us quite a rounded picture of a really vibrant football culture that people probably wouldn't have been aware of beforehand. So is there anything else, any sort of aspects of the book that you think we've missed that you think are really important to the story?
Well, there's a lot of kind of different facets to the book. I speak of my friend Irving. His father played football for a league football in Albania, and that kind of tells the story of how how hopes and realities and broken dreams came into play for a lot of players, because in a socialist state, you didn't have the freedom to choose what you wanted to be. You had to be what the regime prescribed for you. And there were a lot of talented players who fell by the wayside, and that covers the story of that. There's the match day experience, which all of the detail in that narrative was given to me by Irving, who's become a very close friend, and a big chunk of the book wouldn't have been writable without his contribution. So there's a lot in there. I like to think, when I wrote the book, I was thinking, every page, let's put 5 things in that people didn't know. So
Right.
that's what I do. And with Albania, it's easy because nobody knew really, apart from if you hadn't lived through the era, if you weren't an Albanian, you wouldn't know any of the stuff that's in the book. So I'm hoping it'll be a surprise, and I'm hoping people will look at it and go, I didn't know that. I didn't like things like the first kind of golden goal. It was an Albanian.
Yeah.
It was an Albanian idea.
What, the 60s or the 50s? It was a long time before the...
Yeah, 1960. It was first trialled in the youth tournaments in Europe in 1993, and only came into effect in 1998. Well, the first golden goal was scored in Albania in 1960. So predates it by 3 decades. So there was that. There was the guy who scored 7 penalties in an Albanian Cup final. Another story that beggars belief. So. And Mario Kempes being the manager of Lushna, another incredible story. So there's lots of these kind of incredible stories that are being told in the English language for the first time. So I hope that really gives it some kudos, some interest for people who like football in its entirety, because it's a kind of book that I would want to read. So I hope that's enough to kind of persuade other people to pick it up. But it, as you said before, it's written with passion. It's written with a real kind of investment in Albania and its football. So, and I hope that kind of shines through.
Like you say, it's very clearly written with passion. It's a story I didn't know great deal about, and like you say, you cover so many aspects of it in such detail, from the kind of everyday football culture to the very like highest levels, and also that kind of interaction of how the state and how external life in Albania kind of impacted on the footballing experience for everybody involved. So doing a quick maths on the 280 pages, if people want to learn around 1400 things about Albanian football, where can they find your book? What are the details?
Well, obviously for convenience, you can get it from Amazon. So it's available there from the 8th of April. Well, it's available to pre-order now, but you can buy it. Its release date is the 8th of April. All of the other kind of, a plethora of places where you can get books from. Although I always think it's nicer to just walk into a bookshop and buy it off the shelf. So if you get the chance, support your local bookshop and go and buy it there. There's a book launch in Birmingham forthcoming as well. That's on May the 4th, which also happens to be my birthday. So if you want to bring me a present along as well, that'd be very much appreciated. Just getting it in there, But no, there's going to be books available to purchase there, and of course I'll be signing, and we can have a chat there if you like. And if you wish to get in touch with me, talk to me about any aspects of the book or football in general, because I'm a bit of an all-rounder, you can find me on my Twitter site at Football Geeks, and just DM me, and we'll chat all day about football.
Great. Well, as you said, it's inside the Hermit Kingdom. As you say, it's available very shortly, available for pre-order at the moment. And again, it's a fantastic, really detailed, really passionate history of Albanian football. It's not something you considered. Definitely worth, picking up and giving a read through, because like you say, it's just a side of football that we won't have seen before. So in the flip of the usual roles, I'd like to thank you for being our guest then today, Phil.
Alex, thanks for doing this, mate. I'm very much appreciated, and we'll reconvene for your new book, which is coming out soon in late May, isn't it? Double Diamond, the Umbro story of Umbro, and I can imagine that's going to be fantastic too.
Much more familiar story, perhaps.
Yeah, mate, but still one that needs to be told. I love him. Everybody who loves football loves Umbro, so I'm sure you're going to get plenty of traction on that one, mate.
Great, thank you.
Take care. All the best.